Hi there, my name is Floyd. Welcome to today's story, where we'll take a closer look at a chilling case of family secrets, control, and obsession. Stick with me as we uncover what really happened behind the walls of a seemingly perfect home. Let's dive in. 911 call, June 14th, 2022, 11:43 p.m. The voice on the other end of the line is frantic, barely able to get the words out. It's a young woman, gasping for air as she stumbles through the darkness. Her name? Hannah Rivers. "Please help me! He's going to kill me!" Her words are barely audible, trembling with fear. The dispatcher tries to ask questions, but before they can get a response, the line goes dead. Silence. A cold night in Copper Falls, Colorado, and a young woman is running for her life. The only clue left behind is that desperate call for help. The question now, what led to this moment? Hannah Rivers, a 22-year-old woman, has always been quiet and thoughtful. But beneath her calm exterior, she's been carrying a heavy burden since losing her father 2 years ago. The grief made her vulnerable, but she's also found strength in that struggle. Moving into her stepfather's mansion in Copper Falls should have been a fresh start. Instead, it's been far from peaceful. Her stepfather, Evan Lancaster, is a man of influence. At 55, he built a reputation as a successful and well-respected businessman. He's charming to everyone who meets him, but behind the scenes, his control over his family is hard to ignore. He likes things to be his way, and his desire for order extends into every aspect of the household. Then there's Daniel, Evan's 25-year-old son. At first glance, he seems like the protective older stepbrother. But as time passed, Hannah noticed a change. Daniel's behavior became more unsettling, more invasive. He always seemed to be watching, as if waiting for something. Small things started happening around the house, and it wasn't long before Hannah began to feel like Daniel wasn't just a family member. He was a threat. The Lancaster estate itself is a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Copper Falls. The town is known for its wealthy residents, grand houses, and well-manicured lawns. But like many things that look perfect on the outside, behind those gates, the Lancasters' secrets are hidden deep, and the mansion's luxury conceals something far more sinister. Now, we know the key players. But how did it all come to this? Hannah's move to the Lancaster mansion seemed like a chance for a new beginning. It was January 2022 when she and her mother, Claire, left their modest home and stepped into a life of wealth and luxury. But soon after they settled in, the house's grandeur felt more like a gilded cage. Hannah, already dealing with her grief, found herself growing more isolated in the vast mansion. Claire, now married to Evan Lancaster, was caught up in her new life. Her focus had shifted entirely to Evan and the social circles they now belonged to. Claire was no longer the supportive mother Hannah had always known. Instead, she seemed blind to the strange things happening in the house, and to the growing tension between Hannah and her stepbrother Daniel. At first, Daniel was polite, almost protective, as if he was trying to make Hannah feel comfortable in her new home. He'd offer to show her around town or talk to her about the family business. But soon, his behavior changed. He began appearing in places where she didn't expect him. Objects in her room would be moved, lights flickered when no one else was around, and late at night, Hannah swore she could hear footsteps outside her bedroom door. Every time Hannah mentioned it, her mother dismissed her concerns. "You're imagining things, Hannah. You need to relax," Claire would say, as if Hannah's worries were nothing more than stress. Even Evan brushed it off, insisting that the mansion was old and creaky, and that these things happen in big houses. But Daniel? He never brushed it off. He would smile, a strange smile that never quite reached his eyes, and say something like, "You've always been a bit jumpy, haven't you?" As weeks turned into months, Hannah's unease grew. She began to feel trapped, not just by the mansion's high walls, but by the people inside it. Evan's insistence on keeping family matters private, his need for control, made her feel like an outsider in her own home. Claire's growing distance left her with no one to turn to, but it was Daniel who frightened her the most. There was something darker beneath his surface, something that went beyond sibling rivalry. The way he seemed to study her, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike, left Hannah constantly on edge. She started locking her bedroom door at night, but the feeling of being watched never left. The question was no longer if something was wrong in the Lancaster home. The question was when things would take a turn for the worse. It was June 15th, 2022, just after midnight, when the police arrived at the Lancaster mansion. They had been called to the property after tracking Hannah's desperate 911 call. The officers stepped out of their cars into the cold night air, shining their flashlights into the dense woods that surrounded the estate. All they knew was that a young woman was in danger. But when they reached the mansion, there was no sign of Hannah. Following the trail into the woods, the officers found her phone, half buried in the mud. A few feet away, there was something else, a trail of blood leading deeper into the dark. The search intensified, and as the minutes ticked by, they began to fear the worst. Then, they found him, Daniel Lancaster. He was dirty, covered in mud and scratches, standing alone in the woods. His clothes were torn, his eyes wide but calm. "I was trying to stop her," he told the officers. "She's always been unstable. She ran and I chased her to help." But his story didn't add up. Daniel's calmness didn't match the urgency of the situation, and there was no sign of Hannah. The search continued, and nearly an hour later they found her, hidden under an overturned boat by the pond. She was bleeding from a wound on her head, trembling, barely conscious. When officers reached her, she whispered the same words over and over. "Daniel did it. He's trying to kill me." The scene was chaotic. A once pristine mansion, now the center of a police investigation. Two siblings, one claiming to help, the other barely alive, accusing him of something far darker. As Hannah was rushed to the hospital, the officers had one clear mission: figure out what really happened that night. The truth was just beginning to unravel. With Hannah safely in the hospital, detectives wasted no time in trying to piece together the events of that night. Daniel's story didn't make much sense. His calm demeanor in the woods and his vague explanation of trying to help left investigators with more questions than answers. Something felt off, but they needed to hear Hannah's side of the story. Hours later, Hannah regained consciousness and agreed to speak with detectives. Her voice was weak, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She began to recount the events leading up to that terrifying night. For months, Hannah explained, her life had been filled with strange occurrences, small things that no one else seemed to notice. It started with items going missing from her room, her keys, a book, a necklace her father had given her. She'd find them later, in odd places around the mansion. Doors that she was sure she had locked would be open when she returned. Lights flickered at night, and sometimes she'd wake up to the sound of footsteps outside her door. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a reaction to the stress of adjusting to her new life. But when she brought it up to her mother or Evan, they dismissed her concerns. Claire would tell her she was being overly sensitive, that the mansion was old, and these things happened. Evan echoed the same sentiment. But Daniel? Daniel's response was always unsettling. He would smile, a cold, knowing smile, and tell her, "You've got to be careful, Hannah. This house can get to you." But as time went on, things escalated. Hannah began to receive strange text messages from an unknown number. The messages were short and cryptic. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." She tried to trace the number, but had no luck. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was behind it all. The way he seemed to always be watching her, how he showed up in places unexpectedly, made her feel like she was under constant surveillance. The final straw came a week before the incident. Hannah overheard a conversation between Evan and Daniel in Evan's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard them discussing a new will, one that would cut Claire and Hannah out entirely. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Evan was planning to leave everything to Daniel. That night she tried to confront her mother, but Claire dismissed her again, saying it must be a misunderstanding. But Hannah knew better. Something wasn't right. The night of the attack, Hannah had been in her room when Daniel knocked on her door. His usual calm facade was gone, and he looked angry, his voice sharp as he told her they needed to talk. She refused, but he barged in anyway, accusing her of trying to ruin the family. His words became more aggressive. "You don't belong here, Hannah. You never did. You've been a problem since you arrived, and now it's time to fix it. Fearing for her life, Hannah tried to escape. She ran through the hallways of the mansion, down the stairs, and out into the woods. Daniel chased her, catching up and hitting her over the head with something heavy. Dazed and bleeding, she managed to get far enough to call 911, but he was right behind her. That's when she dropped her phone and hid under the boat, hoping it would be enough to stay alive until help arrived. As detectives listened to Hannah's story, the pieces started falling into place. Daniel wasn't just a concerned stepbrother. He had been orchestrating a campaign of fear, trying to drive Hannah out, or worse. Now, with her testimony, the investigation had a clear direction. Daniel Lancaster was no longer just a suspect. He was at the center of a much darker plot. As detectives dove deeper into the case, they began focusing on the Lancaster family's financial arrangements. Hannah's story about overhearing Evan and Daniel discussing a new will raised alarms. It suggested there was more at play than just family tension. There was a motive. A search of Evan Lancaster's office revealed crucial documents that confirmed Hannah's fears. The will had indeed been changed recently. The new version cut out both Hannah and her mother, Claire, leaving everything to Daniel. This included Evan's massive fortune, the estate, and various business interests. For Hannah and Claire, there would be nothing, no inheritance, no security. The detectives now had a potential motive for why Daniel would want to eliminate Hannah, but there was still more to uncover. When confronted with the discovery, Evan insisted that the will was simply a precaution. Hannah was never going to fit into our life, he said. She was always troubled, always causing issues. He painted a picture of a stepdaughter who was difficult, unstable, and a threat to the family's unity. But Hannah's story suggested otherwise. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control. Daniel stood to gain everything if Hannah and Claire were out of the picture. He saw Hannah as an obstacle, someone who could potentially expose the truth about the will and ruin his chances of securing the family fortune. His behavior over the past few months, the manipulation, the intimidation, the stalking, all pointed to a calculated effort to make Hannah feel powerless. To make matters even darker, the investigation uncovered Daniel's obsession with Hannah. Detectives found dozens of text messages Daniel had sent to a friend, talking about how he had to get rid of her and that she didn't belong in the family. These texts revealed a sinister side to Daniel, confirming that his actions were driven not just by greed, but by an unhealthy fixation on Hannah. The will and the messages painted a chilling picture. Daniel Lancaster had a clear motive to get Hannah out of the way, and now detectives had the evidence to prove it. The evidence detectives uncovered left no doubt. Daniel Lancaster had both motive and means. But it was the events on the night of June 14th, 2022, that finally revealed the true extent of his plan. That evening, tensions in the mansion had reached a breaking point. Hannah had been in her room, trying to avoid Daniel, when he showed up unannounced, his usual calm replaced by anger. He accused her of trying to tear the family apart, his voice growing louder as he stepped closer. "You're in the way, Hannah. You don't belong here. You never did," he spat, his eyes cold. Hannah tried to leave, but Daniel wouldn't let her. She ran from the room, down the hallway, and out into the night, with Daniel right behind her. It wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a chase. She bolted through the woods, desperate to escape, but Daniel was faster. He caught up with her near the pond, hitting her on the head with a heavy object. Dazed and bleeding, she stumbled away, managing to hide under an overturned boat near the water's edge. That's when she made the frantic 911 call. As the police pieced together the timeline, Hannah's story matched perfectly with the evidence they had found. Her phone was discovered near the pond, the blood trail confirmed her injury, and the scratches on Daniel's arms told a clear story. He had been in pursuit. Daniel's claim that he had been trying to help Hannah quickly fell apart. His obsession with getting her out of the family, combined with his desire for control over the Lancaster fortune, had driven him to violence. Now, the detectives had everything they needed to bring him in. As the investigation unfolded, a forensic psychologist was brought in to evaluate Daniel Lancaster. The profile that emerged was disturbing. Daniel was described as having deep-seated control issues, particularly when it came to those he viewed as threats. His obsession with power, combined with his fixation on Hannah, created a dangerous situation. The psychologist noted that Daniel's behavior fit the pattern of someone who needed to dominate those around him. When Hannah didn't fall in line, she became an obstacle in his mind, someone who had to be removed. This explained not only his actions leading up to the attack, but also the months of manipulation and gaslighting designed to make her feel isolated and vulnerable. The revelations rocked the quiet town of Copper Falls. The Lancasters had always been seen as a model family, wealthy, successful, and powerful. But behind the mansion's walls was a story of control, obsession, and violence that no one could have imagined. Neighbors, once envious of the family's status, were horrified. The media descended on Copper Falls, turning the quiet community into the center of a sensational case. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how did no one see this coming? The legal proceedings that followed Daniel Lancaster's arrest drew national attention. The courtroom was packed when the trial began in October 2022. Media outlets were camped outside, eager to report on every twist and turn of the case. The once private Lancaster family was now under the spotlight, and the public was eager to see how justice would be served. Daniel pleaded not guilty, maintaining his story that he had only been trying to help Hannah. His defense team painted a picture of a troubled young woman, suggesting that Hannah had a history of paranoia and instability. They argued that she had overreacted to a family argument and fled into the woods, where Daniel had followed her out of concern. The defense attempted to undermine Hannah's credibility, claiming she had exaggerated the events out of fear and confusion. But the prosecution was prepared. They had the text messages Daniel had sent to his friend, revealing his desire to remove Hannah from the family. They presented the updated will, showing the clear financial motive Daniel had to eliminate Hannah and her mother from the picture. The prosecutor described Daniel as a man driven by greed and obsession, willing to do whatever it took to secure his future. Hannah's testimony was the most emotional moment of the trial. She recounted the months of manipulation, the night of the attack, and the terror she felt as she ran for her life. Her calm but emotional retelling of the events left a deep impact on the jury, who could see the toll it had taken on her. The physical evidence, her injuries, the blood trail, and the location of her phone all matched her account. Daniel's composed demeanor throughout the trial began to crack. As the evidence mounted against him, his cold, emotionless facade became harder to maintain. The text messages, the will, and Hannah's testimony painted a clear picture of a man whose desire for control had turned into violent obsession. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning their verdict: guilty of attempted murder. Daniel Lancaster was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Evan Lancaster, though not charged with a crime, faced public disgrace. His reputation as a successful businessman was shattered, and the Lancaster family name became synonymous with scandal and betrayal. For Hannah, justice had been served, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. With Daniel Lancaster sentenced to 30 years in prison, justice had been served. But for Hannah, the end of the trial didn't mean the end of her struggles. The trauma of what she endured left deep emotional scars. She and her mother, Claire, left Copper Falls shortly after the trial, hoping to start fresh far from the shadow of the Lancaster family mansion. Hannah's journey to recovery would be long. The psychological toll of the manipulation and the attack weighed heavily on her. In an interview months after the trial, she spoke quietly about the events, saying, "I'll never forget what happened, but I'm learning to move forward. I'm done living in fear." The Lancaster mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood empty, a grim reminder of the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. The townspeople of Copper Falls were left shaken by the revelations, their once idyllic perception of the Lancaster family completely shattered. No one could have imagined that such a calculated and dangerous plot had been brewing in their own community. Though the trial was over, the media attention continued for some time, with articles and news reports dissecting the case. The story of Hannah's survival became one of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. As the dust settled and life moved on, one question remained in the minds of many. How far can obsession and control drive someone, even within the walls of a family? And that's the story of how a family's dark secrets unraveled into a deadly plot. What do you think? Was Daniel's obsession always there? Or did something else push him over the edge? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.